welcome to today's video. In today's video I want to talk to you about manual mode. Now in photography the term manual mode is always a term that you'll hear being thrown around, and I seen a comment online the other day that actually said professionals only shoot in manual mode. Now I remember when I started out in photography trying to get my head around manual mode and learning the exposure triangle was something that I found very daunting. Now you might find yourself in the same case. You might find that you're trying to learn manual mode or you're trying to understand the exposure triangle a little bit better. So the exposure triangle actually consists of your ISO, your aperture and your shutter speed. Now these 3 points on the triangle, when you're in manual mode you do have absolutely full control of all these parameters, and in order to take the shot you need to make sure that these are all right, and having that camera set in manual mode you'd need to adjust all 3 of these parameters in order to take your shot. Now I actually make money. I do my full-time living from photography and videography, and I actually don't shoot in manual mode at all. I shoot in another mode, which is what I'm going to talk to you about today. But in manual mode, as I said, you do have full control of all of these, but sometimes that could end up in missing the shot. You might actually see an opportunity and your camera settings just aren't right for that shot. Maybe your shutter speed was too slow, your ISO was a bit too high, and you introduced some sort of noise and grain into that shot, or your aperture wasn't right and it's not in focus. But in today's video I want to go over a mode on your camera that you'd actually be able to use, which actually takes a bit of weight off your shoulders and gets the camera doing that little bit more. When you do start out, just like myself when I started out, as I mentioned, manual mode can be quite daunting. Understanding the exposure triangle can be quite daunting. This isn't actually a cheat code. Putting your camera into this mode doesn't actually get you away from learning the exposure triangle. I would advise that you do take time to learn the exposure triangle and actually learn to shoot in manual, because it does benefit you. But if you are feeling a little bit overwhelmed, then stay tuned because this video is for you. But most modern cameras now have what's known as aperture mode. On most cameras it's with a dial with the letter A. Some cameras it's AV, or even if you're on Fuji, I think Fuji on certain cameras that have top dials and stuff, you have to go into the camera settings to adjust it. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's all easy. You do have to set some parameters, but what I find that shooting in aperture priority mode just allows me to get shots a lot quicker. I never miss an opportunity to see a shot. It does help when you are in sort of ever-changing light. So I am a wedding photographer. I could be in a sort of dimly lit situation facing to a certain side of one room, and then I turn around and something's happening behind me and it's backlit. Maybe there's double doors or a big window and there's a big amount of light coming through it. But shooting an aperture priority, like I said, the camera does quite a bit of the heavy lifting for you. You still do need to set your parameters on the camera, but for my Nikon I actually shoot in aperture priority mode, but I do set a parameter of having my ISO set to the lowest, which is 100, and then I have it at the highest, which I'm comfortable at. And obviously this is a full frame camera as well, so shooting with a higher ISO is not too bad because you can just change that in post. You can get noise reduction and things, so if you've got grain in your shots you can actually change that in editing. So like I said, shooting in RAW is essential. Having all that metadata inside your picture file, taking it into the editor, you can do an awful lot more with it. But if you find yourself comfortable shooting with JPEGs, by all means do shoot in the mode of RAW plus JPEG. So if you just prefer, and if JPEG turns out alright and you're happy with it and it's to your style and to your taste, then you can just upload that and put it on your socials or do whatever you're doing with it. But if you don't, then you've always got the opportunity, if you've got the RAW file of that as well, to take that into your editor and do an awful lot of work to it. So I shoot, as I said, in aperture priority. Now I did shoot in manual mode, but I found that when I was doing weddings I actually missed quite a few shots. But now that I've got the camera doing some of the heavy lifting, I just basically set my aperture to a certain point. Now this all varies, it depends where you are, what you're shooting. Like for myself in a wedding I like to shoot wide open, so I have my aperture at f2. I keep it at that, and then obviously I adjust my other parameters on the exposure triangle of my ISO and my shutter speed. I actually set my shutter speed, you can delve into your menus, and I set mine to 1/250th, so it'll never go lower than that. So no matter what I'm shooting, it's going to be pretty fast enough to stop any motion blur. Sometimes, depending on the scene, I might change that to 1/400 just to make sure that no matter what I shoot, it is going to be tack sharp. And on the fly then, in aperture mode, you are only just worrying about your aperture on the camera. Now I'm out today in Moylvra, it's a beautiful sunny day, had the drone up and I'm just walking around this beautiful village just taking shots. But I am shooting an aperture priority. I will vary from f4 to f5.6 if I'm just shooting sort of wider scenes. You will see some photos popping up in the video of maybe some close-ups, maybe some of the pink thrift here on the coastline, maybe some flowers and stuff. If I see something nice, that is then stopped down to f2. But the aperture mode, basically I set my exposure to a certain point, so I actually shoot about just half a stop under perfectly exposed. I just let the camera do all the hard calculations for me. Now this doesn't essentially mean that I'm skimping or I'm, you know, not a professional, if you like, as that comment said, because I'm not shooting in manual mode. It is a sort of semi-automatic manual, if you like to put it that way. It is an easier mode just to shoot in. I actually always shoot in that in my professional work. In my day-to-day life, like today out shooting with the Nikon Zf, I am just shooting in aperture priority. But like I said, you do have to adjust those parameters on your camera, and it does vary on what it is that you're shooting. But a day like today, I just basically put mine at f5.6. My shutter speed, as I mentioned, does not go under 1/250th of a second, and my ISO is capped between 100 and 6400, which today, with all this light from the sun, as you can see behind me, it's not really going to affect it. But like I said, if you are feeling a bit overwhelmed by the manual mode on cameras, don't be. I was at the start, and to be honest, I just went out, kept learning it. But for me, I would advise that you just learn the exposure triangle and what each point of that triangle does and how it affects your shot. So here we've got a bit of pink thrift, which grows on the coastline here on Anglesey. Beautiful little sort of seaside flower. So in aperture priority mode, what you need to do essentially is just make sure that you are changing your aperture. Now obviously aperture is a part of the exposure triangle, as I mentioned, but because I've set the parameters in the camera on shutter speed and ISO, the camera will decide those factors for me. I just have to change my aperture on the fly. So the only thing that I am changing is, like I said, the f-stop number. So this is an f2. So what I'm going to try and do is try and get a nice shot here of this pink thrift without including you in the background. So if I just take a shot, obviously we've got that nice separation from the foreground, the subject element, which is the pink thrift, and then obviously separating the background, which is the coastline and the sea. Basically that is the only thing that I changed. But as I carry on my walk now, I will stop down to about f5.6 so that I know that everything is sharp in my photo. But if I do see something like a detail shot, a bit like the pink thrift, then I will stop and I will change down to f2, open it wider so that I can get that nice separation and get that black background blur, which is really handy. So like I said, it's not as easy as just popping your camera into aperture priority and getting away with it. There is a few things that you do have to change, but set those limits, and the only thing you got to worry about is your aperture. As I mentioned, the only thing that I do need to change on my camera now that I'm in aperture priority is my aperture. In a scene such as this, where I want to try and get everything in focus, I just stop my f-stop down. I'm currently shooting in f5.6. I probably will be between f4, f5.6 for the remainder of these shots now that I go for my walk. But as I said, when I do come across something like a detail shot, or I do want that separation, or I want to blur things out, I just stop my aperture down. I think it is important to say as well, when you are shooting on the exposure dial or even on your light meter on your screen, if you just make sure that you get that right as well, whether you shoot where the light meter is perfectly exposed or whether or not you just shoot slightly under. I actually shoot just about a stop, or half a stop under perfectly exposed, just so I got a bit more stuff to retain in post editing. So like things like highlights, shadow detail, I can manipulate the shots just that little bit better. So it's actually a nice shot there, to be honest. So like I said, in these kind of scenes, I want everything wide open, so the only parameter that I change on the camera is my aperture, and I have stopped that down to f5.6. But if you've got a camera and you are feeling a bit overwhelmed with learning manual mode or the exposure triangle, like I said, you still have to learn it. It's not something that you can completely avoid if you are taking up photography, but it is essential that you try and get your head around it. But don't be overwhelmed by it. Go out and enjoy photography, use your camera, pop it in aperture priority. Like I said, I'm a professional myself. I make my living from photography, but I don't shoot in manual mode. So that comment that I seen online really gave me a bit of an ick, to be honest, because there are people out there that do think that they're professional because they shoot in manual mode and manual mode only. But for me, the reason I shoot in aperture priority, and for the reason why I think you should, is because that you won't miss your shots. You won't miss something. Like in a scene like today, just popping my camera in f5.6, as I said, I can get everything nice and sharp. But in situations like weddings, as I mentioned, the light could change from one direction to the other, and if I'm fiddling with my settings from this scene to that scene where it could be backlit by a window, or I'm shooting into a room with the bride or something, then I might miss the shot because I'm fiddling with my settings, trying to get my shutter speed, my ISO and my aperture correct for the photo. So aperture does actually take a bit of weight off your shoulders. You can enjoy going out shooting a bit more, and I think that you should go out and try shooting in aperture priority, because I don't think you'll regret it in any way. I tell everyone to shoot in aperture priority. Manual mode for me is, I've learned it, I can shoot in it. I could pop it into full manual mode and spend the rest of today shooting and getting shots for you, but I won't. I just keep it in aperture priority because, as I said, the camera will do most of the heavy lifting for me. I just set my f-stop, my aperture number. Like I said, it's going to be between 4 and f5.6 today, and the camera does the rest for me. Do set those limits. If you're on a crop sensor camera, just know that it doesn't allow in as much light as a full frame sensor does, like the Nikon Zf or any other full frame sensor out there. So just make sure that you sit and set your parameters, your limits, to a point where it's within the camera's capability. I mean, if you're on a crop sensor and you're shooting upwards of 6400 on your ISO, then you are going to get a lot of grain and noise in that image, so you're going to need to do a lot more work in post. Shoot in RAW, because obviously you want that full range flexibility in post to do your shots. I only shoot RAW, I don't shoot RAW in JPEG, but if you do feel comfortable shooting in JPEG, by all means do so, but I do heavily suggest that you try and shoot in RAW plus JPEG, so that if the JPEG doesn't turn out how you wanted it, you can always edit it in post with your RAW. So that's it really, that's all I wanted to talk about. Try and pop your camera into aperture priority. It's the only mode that my camera lives in, and all my cameras, in fact, my R6, my Canon RP, are all shot in aperture priority. So that's it really, that's all I wanted to say. If you are overwhelmed by manual mode, don't be, but try and get out there, try and get your head around the exposure triangle. It is easy. I might actually do a video about understanding manual mode and making manual mode easy. It could be a good idea for the next video, but I've got a couple more things that I want to cover in my next up and coming videos. But I definitely think that trying to simplify manual mode and understanding the exposure triangle on a camera is definitely a video that is worth making, just to help you guys at home. But as I said, pop your camera in A or AV or into the menus and set your parameters right. Get your aperture priority in that mode, get that mode going. Set your parameters on the camera so that the shutter speed doesn't go under something else, under a set number. Like I said, mine's 1/250th. I sometimes go 1/500 or 400, just to make sure that everything's tack sharp. But like I said, everything else, like the ISO, is all counted for by the camera. These things are incredibly intelligent. They are high pieces of equipment, high quality pieces of equipment that can do a lot of the heavy lifting for you, as I mentioned. So pop your camera in aperture priority, go out there, have fun, and as I always say, see the world, capture life. Peace.